There are three topics that autistic men get obsessed with in their late teens to mid-20s. The first is anime. The second is combat sports. And the third is dictators who are responsible for the deaths of tens of millions of people. In an effort to game the YouTube algorithm by catering to my overwhelmingly male audience's tastes, today I'll be looking into what these four dictators would be like if they were fighters in the UFC. Now you might be thinking, hey, there's no way Dana White would allow such horrible people into the UFC. Well, that's where you're wrong. The UFC is the home to fighters who have committed various crimes, ranging from drunk driving to drug use to domestic violence. So I would not put it beyond the UFC to employ the following men as fighters. Starting off with who I think has the greatest potential to be a UFC champion out of these four, I present to you Joseph Stalin, General Secretary of the Communist Party of the USSR. Joseph Stalin was responsible for anywhere from 3 million to 20 million deaths in the USSR, and even more than that if you consider him to be responsible for the high mortality rates of the Red Army during World War II, since he was commander-in-chief of the entire thing. The reason why Joseph Stalin has such high potential to be a UFC champion is because of his ethnic heritage. Now, you might think that since Stalin was the leader of the USSR, he'd be Russian, but this is untrue. Stalin was a Georgian, one of the main countries of the Caucasus and the ethnic homeland of two current UFC champions. In fact, Stalin's birth name was Joseph Vissarionovich Chukashvili, a name which sounds quite similar to a certain cardio goblin that I'm sure you're all familiar with. Stalin is just a nickname meaning man of steel, similar to how we call Patrick Pimblett Paddy or Mauricio Hua Shogun. However, having a solid ethnic background and a good fighter name isn't the only reason why Stalin would have the potential to be a UFC champion. Stalin was born into a life of poverty and abuse, getting viciously beaten by his alcoholic father. And as we know from the likes of Strickland, being beaten as a child is one of the best bases for MMA. Stalin was also a criminal during his days as a communist revolutionary, stealing millions of rubles from armored cars, similar to how Lee Murray stole millions from a bank. John Jones has shown that being a violent criminal helps you in your mixed martial arts career too, so Stalin has that backbone as well. However, Stalin also had some physical limitations that may hinder him from becoming a champion. First of all, he was 5'7", or around Ilia Topuria's height. This would mean that he'd either be a bantamweight or a featherweight, both divisions which are known for the immense skill of their talent. Second, Stalin's left arm was weaker, less flexible, and slightly shorter than his right due to his heavy hentai addiction. I meant an injury that he suffered when he was 12 years old. However, as we've seen from the likes of Michael Bisping, Shara Magomedov, and Nick Newell, missing a body part doesn't mean you can't be a successful mixed martial artist. As for Stalin's style, I suspect he would be the polar opposite of his countryman, Merab. Stalin was a patient man, taking his time to seize power of the Communist Party by strategically taking over the party's bureaucracy by installing party officers who were loyal to himself in key positions. In MMA, this would translate to Stalin waiting on the outside, feinting, calf kicking, and jabbing at range while preparing to land takedowns or devastating blows. His style would be methodical and reliant on the fundamentals, fitting his no-nonsense personality. The key to Stalin's game plans would be his cage cutting, cornering his opponents in the octagon, just like how he isolated political opponents like Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Kamenev before having them assassinated or executed. Stalin's greatest strength and weakness as an MMA fighter would be his paranoia. Stalin was an extremely distrustful leader, constantly spying on what others were up to. As a fighter, he would be very suspicious of his teammates leaking information to opposing camps and would ban anybody from taking sparring footage of him. This would lead to Stalin being very difficult to game plan against, but at the cost of the relationship he has with his teammates. Also, he would totally be the first one to rat out steroid users to drug testing organizations. Now, moving on to another dictator, we have Mao Zedong, the glorious chairman of the People's Republic of China. Mao Zedong was responsible for about 45 million deaths due to starvation from 1958 to 1962, as estimated in a 2010 book by Frank Ducotter. And subsequently, during the Cultural Revolution of 1966 to 1976, a further million or so were estimated to have been killed for their beliefs. Mao wouldn't have the same potential as Stalin, but he does have certain advantages that may help him. First, Mao was beaten by his father as a child, so there's that. And second, Mao was a soldier with legitimate combat experience in the Red Army, where he fought against Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang and the Japanese Imperial Army. Tim Kennedy and Benoit Saint Denis have proven that, while being a soldier is not necessarily the best base for MMA, it still works. Having a military background is associated with having a relentless pace and a never-give-up attitude, which Mao Zedong demonstrated during the Long March, during which Mao led the Red Army in a massive retreat. Much like modern-day Chinese fighters like Song Yadong, Zhang Mingyang, and Israel Adesanya, Mao Zedong would be a striker in the cage. Mao's style would be heavily reliant on feints and exposing his opponent's weaknesses, similar to how he exposed those who were disloyal to the party during the 100 Flowers campaign, where he briefly allowed criticism of the Chinese Communist Party, and then killed everybody who spoke up. And similar to his fellow countryman Israel Adesanya, who prefers the company of dogs, Mao Zedong was a sexual deviant, a 14-year-old girl when he was 68 years old. Therefore, it is safe to assume that Mao Zedong's striking style would likely be quite similar to that of Pat Barry's. And you guys all know what Pat Barry did, right? Pat Barry was a journeyman at best, and I honestly don't see Mao Zedong faring any better. My prediction for Mao as a UFC fighter would be as one of those guys who floats around the unranked area of the bantamweight division, getting KOs and getting KO'd on random Apex fight nights. But the same can't be said for the next dictator. That's right, I'm talking about Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel. Now, you might be thinking, hey, isn't Netanyahu, democratically elected? How can he be a dictator, huh? Well, how can Netanyahu be a democratically elected leader when he's out there trying to ethnically cleanse 5 million people who, if his country were a real democracy, would be a part of his state? And this is where Ben Shapiro would be like, but if they were allowed to be a part of Israel, they'd overwhelm us in the polls. Well then, tough luck. Maybe you should, give them their own independent country then. Just a suggestion, right? Anyways, the reason why Netanyahu is a part of this list is because he's committed enough atrocities to qualify for it. Granted, the kill count is much lower, but in Netanyahu's case, we've got footage which helps confirm the accuracy of these numbers, which can't be said of the other 3 dictators in this video, where the estimates on the numbers dead vary greatly depending upon the source that you consult. When it comes to Netanyahu's potential as a mixed martial artist, I'd have to say that it's probably quite low. The only thing that really is going for Netanyahu is that he's a criminal because he's being investigated for corruption charges, but that's about it. And besides, who's the best MMA fighter they've been able to produce? Natan Levy? Yeah, the guy who beat Mike Breeden and Gennaro Valdez, who were both cut from the UFC after going a total of 1-6, with that one win from Breeden being against Anshul Jubilee. Not a good look to say the least. However, in Netanyahu's case, I think that he could expect some extra assistance, shall we say, in his rise up the rankings. I fully expect Netanyahu would be the recipient of some of the most egregious favoritism from the UFC imaginable, similar to how Israel receives billions of dollars of aid from the United States, despite being a first world country with an advanced economy and a massive cybersecurity sector. Similar to how Sean O'Malley and Bo Nickel get treated, Netanyahu would get a massive push from the UFC despite not having a large organic fan base. In other words, just like Nina Drama, Netanyahu as an MMA fighter would be an industry plant. For his fight style, Netanyahu would likely rely upon his Krav Maga skills. And now, Krav Maga, right? Hear me out here. Krav Maga is a martial art developed by the IDF, and it's the only martial art, I repeat here, which explicitly teaches you to eye gouge, strike to the groin, and hit your opponent to the back of the head. The USSR, right? They developed combat sambo for their soldiers, and combat sambo, as far as I'm aware, doesn't teach this. Krav Maga is the only martial art that does this. I wonder why. I'm just baffled. Why do they teach it like this? Anyways, moving on now. Getting back to Netanyahu, right? Netanyahu, just like how Michael Chandler got away with all of his illegal tactics against Charles Oliveira and Dustin Poirier, he would get away with his cheating too because of the UFC's favoritism. Netanyahu, who is 184 centimeters or 6 foot even, will likely be a welterweight in the UFC. And in the UFC as it is now, Netanyahu would likely be given matchups against fighters on the decline like Neil Magny, Warlley Alves, and the decaying corpse of Tony Ferguson. Because, Netanyahu, just knowing who he is, he probably likes to pick on people who are, not as strong as him, right? Just based upon his personality. Off of this 3-fight win streak, he would be allowed to enter the top 15, after which Netanyahu would be matched up against someone in the top 5. Netanyahu would then be given a robbery decision to justify a title shot, after which he would then lose by vicious first-round KO to the GOAT, Bilal Muhammad. Anyways, now that we're finished with the Prime Minister of the American government, let's move on to the guy who you're not allowed to talk about on YouTube. Yes, that's right, I'm talking about the artist who shall not be named. You know, the one dictator you're not allowed to talk about without fear of getting your channel terminated? The guy whose crimes against humanity are considered to be so bad that you can't talk about them without risking being flagged for spreading disinformation? But hey, I'm pretty sure you've been taught in school about how bad this guy was, since he's also the only dictator whose crimes get a serious amount of attention in most education systems for some reason. You know, even though Stalin and Mao probably killed a greater total number of people, and Pol Pot was probably more brutal in his methods. But yeah, anyways, getting into the watercolor merchant of Vienna and his potential as an MMA fighter, I'd say it's definitely there, but there are a few things that hold him back. First, he does have that childhood trauma that could spur him to be a fighter, just like Stalin and Mao. He also was an accomplished soldier, being awarded the Iron Cross, second class for his feats in World War I. Second, he was a big proponent of boxing, and supported Max Schmeling, who fought Joe Louis twice, winning by KO once and then losing by KO in the rematch. Due to his background in art, the big bad villain guy of modern history would likely have a very creative fighting style, relying upon complex kicks and movement. He would also have an explosive approach to fights, aiming to finish the fight early by attacking his opponent's weakest points, similar to the blitzkrieg tactics he employed in World War II. However, there's a few problems with him becoming champion. First, Austria has not produced any high-level MMA fighters except for Alexander Rakic. And Rakic is a Serb by heritage, so that would make him an Untermenschen according to Mustache Man's classifications. The only ethnically German fighter I can think of who has had a lot of success in the UFC is Drew Dober.
He's a black... What?
But you know, leaving that aside. More importantly, the leader of the beer hall putsch was a vegetarian. Yes, he liked to eat his tofu and drink his soy milk. There's a number of reasons why people think that this was the case, such as a psychological reaction to the death of his niece, who he held dearly. I personally tend to believe that this was because of the influence of the philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer, the first incel in modern history, who was an early advocate for animal rights. But as Lucas Tracy pointed out about Ian Gary, eating a plant-based diet may drain the fury of his strength and cardio, leaving him susceptible to gassing out in the later rounds. He'd likely be quite similar to Zabit Magomedsharipov, insanely creative and talented on the feet, but with very little cardio and unable to compete in 5-round fights. And since he's 175 centimeters, or 5'9", he'd be fighting in either featherweight or lightweight, which are both some of the most competitive divisions in the UFC. I can see him becoming ranked, but I don't see him getting the belt due to his lack of cardio. Anyways, that's the end of this video. Subscribe for more high-effort MMA infotainment.
Have you been a good piggy today? Oink, oink? No.
Oi, 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 oi.